So at this point we're ready to finish the value structure on our drawing, and I've done actually quite a few revisions since I looked at my drawing up against the wall. I realized a lot of my angles were off, and I had drawn some of these too small. They may still be a little bit too small, but I think we're closer now. And usually the first step that I'll do is just start bringing in some of the light values. So you want to be careful not to erase too bright, because if you go all the way to pure white, then there's no way to add highlights in there later. So usually what I do is just look for those big shapes of value to start with, and I work kind of generally all over. I don't want to do too much erasing on any one shape until I get some of the neighboring tones blocked in, so that I'm careful not to over erase some areas. But squint your eyes at the actual object and just look for some of those simple shapes first. So I'm going to go in, and I notice that since the light's coming from the left side of a lot of these forms are lit, but when you're looking at the inner curve, so like in this case, I'm actually darkening the right side of this shape because it's the inside of the curve that's catching some light. So, you know, work kind of slowly. You want to be careful not to overdo it. So like this area is not as bright as these are, so I want to be careful not to go pure white in those areas. I might just, you know, lift a little bit there, and then we'll be adding in some darker values. The vine charcoal is really fragile. It blends really easily, but the other problem is it lifts off in areas where you might not want it lifted off. So we're going to need to be blending some compressed charcoal with this to make the drawing a little bit more durable in the end. But to start with, we just want to try to establish those big patterns of light and shade. So I'm looking for these kind of triangular shapes of light, and it really does help to squint your eyes, because otherwise it's really easy for you to get too, you accentuate the contrast more than they really need to be. So if you can squint your eyes at the composition, at the real life object, then you're less likely to overstate subtle values, and you can keep things in relative proportion. So I'm noticing that here's a spot where the light actually continues across that front fold, and it ends up merging. So there's not really a line here, so I can just sort of let those two areas sort of blend together now. And I'm not erasing to a pure white, but it is a very light value. I'm going to leave, for now, I'm going to leave the base tone of my paper to represent all of my reflected light areas. And then we're going to come in a little bit darker in the shadow core, which it's really important to understand what I'm talking about when I say shadow core. That's the area that separates the direct light from this subtle reflected light. And without that slightly darker shadow core down the, like sort of the center of each fold, or wherever the light meets the reflected light, your image is going to look really flat. So that is the most important thing to make things look three-dimensional, is that shadow core. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about when I say shadow core, please ask me and I'll try to point it out in a few different places so that you know for sure what I mean by that term. But without the shadow core in there, everything is going to feel pretty flat. And then this shape is actually completely lifted out, but I'm going to leave a little bit of charcoal on there just to make it feel like it really is still fabric and not just the white border of the paper. And then we talked a little bit about how these values alternate here. We've got light on the right side here, but then it switches to the left side. And there's a little bit of highlight on the underside of this fold that's getting direct light. And then a little bit of this shape lifted out. So I'm doing almost all my work with my kneaded eraser. I'm not getting the vinyl eraser out at all because it leaves crumbs all over the place. And I'm not ready to bring in any pure whites yet. I want to make sure I'm not going too white too early. This area has quite a bit of light in it, but there's still, so there's a little bit of a highlight that connects this shape down into that fold. And the highlight runs just through the middle of that. It's not the whole shape. So if you erase it too bright, you're going to lose that sense of the highlight down the middle. And then I'm going to go a little bit brighter here. You see how much I'm lifting off the tone just by touching my paper. That means I'm going to need to go back in with some compressed charcoal to make it a little bit more durable on this side. And then I want to blend. I'm going to just kind of block this in as reflected light for now, and we'll come in with some darker shadow cores to kind of help make that a little richer in those areas. This shape, it's going to be a little bit complicated area here, so I've got to be really careful to kind of find that reflected light along the very edge there. I'm not outlining this. I really actually see a little shape of light there, and I might, if it sticks out too much, I may have to blend that in later too. It's hard to know until I get some of those darker values around it whether that's going to be too light or not. And then I see this is not just a straight line here. It's going to merge into some lights that are hitting the inner fold of that fabric. So again, I really stress squinting helps so much to simplify those patterns, because it's pretty easy to get overwhelmed with the complexity of some of these folds if you are looking too closely at all the details to start with. So sometimes you can lift up one layer of the value just with a finger, a clean, surface there. And I'm going to just even out these tones a little bit. We're going to go slightly darker here eventually, but I want to get rid of some of that texture so we can see the shapes a little bit more clearly. And remember, in the end, we have to get rid of all these outlines, so we've got to figure out how it is that we can see those folds without putting a line in between them. So already this is starting to have a little bit more volume. I'm going to start darkening the background a little bit. I want this to be a more durable surface because every time I touch it, I'm lifting up some of the vine charcoal. So I'm going to go in with a really light layer of compressed charcoal now, and don't use the tip of it or you're never going to get rid of those lines, but just use the side with a really light pressure. Make sure you've got plenty of padding underneath your drawing paper so that you're not picking up the texture of the table underneath. And even though this part is in light, so I'm not going solid black. If I did that, then I wouldn't be able to see this cast shadow here. So I'm just kind of striving for a middle range tone, and then I'm going to go a little bit darker. Probably the very darkest spot in my whole drawing is this little bit of cast shadow here. But even that is not solid black. I can see a little bit of light in there, so I might buff it in a little bit, but I don't want it to be as solid of a black as we might have used on our sphere drawings in the background. Okay, so I will kind of even out this tone so it's not too distracting, and that should make it a little bit more durable. So now it's not as easy to lift those areas off as it was when it was just strictly vine charcoal. And we'll be using our masking technique again too. So if we want to hide that vine charcoal line, I can just rub right up to that edge of that fold of fabric, but not worry about making the whole thing blurry. So I want to think about where the tack is as I'm figuring out that angle, and just rub that vine charcoal line out of there. And here too, we want that. All right, and then this is almost a straight line. There might be a little bit of curve in that line, but for now I'm just going to buff that shape as well. Okay, so now to go a little bit darker. So right now this still is pretty fragile. Some of these values will just lift right off, so I'm going to use the compressed charcoal, and I just broke it into a little tiny, maybe just 1 inch long piece. And I'm going to use the side of it and just very lightly add a little bit of tone. This is a light colored piece of fabric, so it is not going to be a solid black there. And when I'm talking about the shadow core, It's this little bit of dark that's in usually the center of the fold or wherever the light meets the shadow. I also see a little bit along here, but again, I want to be careful that it doesn't end up looking like a line. I want it to just feel like that little ridge where the fabric rolls across. And all right, now there's a little bit of a cast shadow here, so slightly darker here as well underneath that fold, but I'm still trying to maintain this nice arc on that shape. There's a little bit of darkness here. Again, it's not a line, it's more of a shape. And then I'm going to go a little bit darker here because I see a pretty strong shadow. So again, you don't want to draw it as a line. I'm laying the charcoal on its side, and you can press a little bit firmer against the edge that's the critical edge where you want a nice crisp edge to the shape. And then extend that cast shadow out. So this fold is casting a shadow onto that lower piece, and then up here there's also a shadow that's being cast onto that second fold. Just put a fingerprint on that one. Okay, and then let's get some other darks in here. This is kind of a middle tone value here. There's a little bit of a, and then this is also pretty dark. So your darkest values will be usually the cast shadow, that where like this fold is casting a shadow onto this next fold. This is a cast shadow here. Or it's going to be areas where the shadow core is. So the area where, like right along here, see how I just have white and then I have light and then the next shape is a shadow? But actually along here we need a little bit more of a shadow core as the fold rolls into the shadow. So I'm trying to make it not super skinny there. There's also a little bit of shadow core right along here on the smaller fold. And it's also casting a shadow, so I can draw in this little rectangular shape of shadow. That's pretty dark there. It's also casting a shadow onto this second fold. And then this shape is quite dark, so again, I'm not drawing a line, I'm laying it on its side and carefully filling that shape in. Okay, now on this one we have a pretty dark cast shadow right beside that fold, so I'm going to let that merge out into this larger fold here. Right here it's a more kind of ends there, and then we see it again pretty dark here. And kind of dark here too. So you're going to be adjusting the values back and forth, blending things in so that we get some nice gentle transitions, and squinting your eyes so that you really start with the big simple shapes first, and then as things start to look like they're making sense, then we can do a little bit more delicate, intricate details. I'm going to buff some of this texture in to help me see the values a little bit more clearly. So this is the shadow core that separates, and I'm going to take it right off to the top there. With big folds, the shadow core is going to be a wider shape, and for smaller folds, it's going to be a more compact shape. So it's really helpful also if you can get up from your drawing occasionally, prop it up so that it's at the same angle as the actual still life, the actual piece of fabric, and try to look at both of them at the same time, and then you can kind of see if you're getting close to the shapes that you need. So I try to work on the whole drawing kind of evenly. I don't just focus on one little fold and then move on to the next shape. I try to block in sort of the same amount of shadows throughout the design, and then come back and add a little bit more information. So you'll get to the point where you've got your big basic shapes filled in, and then you need to try to increase the clarity and crispness of some of the shapes. So I'll do a little bit of that too, just so that you can see what I'm talking about. And in some areas, you may have the shapes just sort of blend together. So like, for example, in this area, I don't really see a line between these two areas. So don't leave a line there if you don't really see it. It's okay to let some areas just sort of flow together. Here the reflected light, or the direct light's a little bit brighter. So I'm going to start pulling out some little bit sharper details, and I don't want it to be an outline, I just want it to be a specific shape here. So I'm noticing that where this fold is, it gets a little bit darker there, so it's not pure white all the way across. And then this fold too, you get to the point where it starts to roll into shadow, so I'm not making that whole shape white, I'm just making the side that's facing the light white. And then this little underside shape may need a little bit of clarity. If you have one of these rigid little vinyl erasers, they're really handy for doing some of the fine details. It's almost like a corduroy texture. It's not necessary to be that specific with it, but if you want to add some of those details, you're welcome to do that. I'm mostly just looking for those big shapes of light and shadow, so sometimes those details actually can be distracting and not really help contribute to the sense of volume there. Here I want to go a little bit brighter, because that's the back side of the curve again, just kind of like this one is. It's not quite as bright as that one, so I can go back in and kind of tone it down a little bit, but I do want it to feel like some light's hitting the inside of that curve. And then I could bring a little bit of a highlight down the middle of this fold, and maybe find this one again where the tack is. So you'll do some fine tuning and looking for those more subtle things as you get some of the key shapes worked out. Here's the little tack, and you do a little bit of blending along there too. There's a little bit of a fold here that I just noticed where there's a second piece of fabric that tucks over, and it's not a line that goes all the way across. I only see it at this one edge, so try to draw it the way you see it there rather than putting in details that aren't really there. This does seem to just sort of blend together there, and I could go quite bright here. I think I'm going to keep the brightest part not at the very edge here, because that is a little further away from us, but I want the tip along here to be nice and white. And then there may be some highlights along here too that I can find to kind of help pull the front of that fold out a little bit more. And then I feel like this edge needs to be a little bit brighter too. So as I'm bringing in some of those light areas, I'm also trying to get rid of any outlines that might be flattening things out. A little bit of shadow that's sinking that back. And there's some highlights on the underside of this shape. Get rid of some of that. Okay, so step back and assess again. I think I want to go a little bit darker on this shadow core again and extend that out into a little bit bigger shape. And there's a little bit of shadow core along here even, which is going all the way up this. And this blends a little more gradually. Here it broadens out into a larger shape. I have a shadow core here. I think I want to go a bit brighter. Let's bring this out a little bit brighter. I'm going to do a little bit more work on it off camera, I think, and then we'll come back as we get closer to being done so that you don't have to watch the whole thing. Okay, so I ended up spending a lot more time on this than I meant to, but some things I want to point out to you so that you can look for them in your own drawing is I spent a lot of time squinting at my reference and then squinting at my drawing and comparing the two. And I would notice, oh, I made this reflected light way too bright, or I made this shadow way too dark, and then I would have to go back and adjust it. So if you end up laying too much black down in there, you can use your scrap of like paper towel or a rag, and you can just go back in and, you know, lighten some areas by rubbing across that. That'll make small adjustments. If you need to make a big adjustment, then switch to your kneaded eraser, and as it gets dirty, just remember to just keep folding it over and it will eventually clean itself. After you've done a lot of charcoal drawings, sometimes they just get so black that there's no way that you can really get them clean again, but you can use them for several drawings if you are constantly stretching it. The other thing I want to point out is how what makes this feel three-dimensional is this shape of dark. So this is the shadow core, and we're going to look for that to be changing in width. So for example, in this part of the fabric where the fold is pretty narrow and the plane change is very abrupt, that shadow core got quite narrow. But then here, when there's a softer, larger fold in the fabric, notice how wide the shadow core gets here. And we try to track the shadow core down throughout the drawing so we can see a little bit of it here. In that small fold, there's a little bit of reflected light. It's not as bright as the direct light. If we make it as bright as the light that's shining from the left, it's going to confuse the drawing. So make sure that when you squint your eyes, these areas of reflected light are not quite as bright as the areas of direct light. You want to make sure you've got sort of three main areas of value. You've got your brightest light values are areas that are getting direct light from the light source. Your second value would be sort of these base tones that have reflected light bouncing back in them, or these half-tone areas where it's not quite in direct line with the light, but it's getting some raking light, like this area and this area. Those will be kind of your middle gray, and that might just be the tone that you started with. So maybe you don't do much to those areas at all. And then for the shadow core and for the cast shadow. So the shadow core is the part that separates the direct light from the reflected light, but the cast shadows are areas where, you know, this fold of fabric is actually casting a shadow onto another fold, and this is a cast shadow here. And then this little triangle shape is a cast shadow from this, you know, this spot where we pinned it to the wall. The light's coming from the sides of this little fold of fabric is casting that shadow onto the background. There's not much cast shadow down here. Most of this is just parts of the fabric that are in a deep fold. But notice that this area right here is a shadow core, and as the fold gets wider, the shadow core gets wider, and then as the fold tapers toward the hub, the cast shadow also gets a little bit narrower as it moves up in that space. And then this is the reflected light here. So again, it's still a pretty dark gray, and when you squint your eyes, it needs to fall into the shadow areas of the shapes and not feel like it's getting direct light. But that's an area where I just made it almost the value that we started with, maybe just a little bit darker, and then the direct light helps pull that out. And then on usually, so you'll have a shadow core, reflected light, and then this is a little bit of cast shadow from probably this fold casting down into that area. So you're going to look for these alternating values of light and dark. And again, we can see we had direct light on this side, shadow on this side, but here, since it's a hollowed out fold, the light's hitting this side and the shadow's on this side. And then, you know, we get down here again too. So shadow core, you can see it's a little bit darker along that ridge, and that then we keep it slightly lighter in here to make it feel like some light is bouncing up on the underside of that fold. And then this darker shape again is cast shadow. Down here we have this little shape is cast shadow. This tiny bit of lighter area is the reflected light, and then right along here where my finger is the shadow core. So it's subtle. When you squint your eyes, they should blend into each other if it's a nice soft fold. And then I'd like you to see if you can get a little bit sharper focus on these folds. So what I did here is, as I was blending in the background, I was protecting the edge of the fold that I wanted to keep bright, and I buffed along there. You can also block out the background and then scrub with your eraser to make those areas nice and bright. But I'd like the front edges of the folds to be as crisp as you can make them. So like this part that's coming forward, you know, go in if you have a small eraser like this, or if you can point your kneaded eraser into a narrow point, you can sometimes just hit a very small section of that and pop out some nice crisp direct light shapes and highlights along here. So there's a little tiny highlight that kind of creeps its way all the way up the folds. Look for it to be a continuous shape. It'll change in width. So here it's really wide. When it gets into a tighter fold, it becomes a small shape, and then it may broaden out again as it gets to a larger area. And usually wherever there's a highlight, there's a slight value in between, and then there might be another highlight on the back side of the fold. So the part that comes out towards us may have a highlight, and then the part that is reversing direction and coming back towards us into a new fold will have another highlight. So the shadows will alternate dark, reflected light, dark, and the highlights will also alternate between bright white, halftone, bright white, again usually. So try to diagram it out. It can get pretty complicated. This was much more complex than I expected. If you don't want to tackle something like this, keep your folds a little bit more simple, or crop in to an area where it's not quite so much going on. But these large folds give you quite a bit of challenge just trying to look for, you see the shadow core along the edge. And if the shadow's on, so usually what I was looking for is, you know, the light's going to be on the same side, and usually about the same percentage of each fold is in shadow to be consistent, and then there's going to be reflected light on the farthest edge toward the shadow, and the shadow core, which is the very darkest part of the shadow, is somewhere toward the middle of the fold. So don't make it go from white to light gray to black, because that will feel really flat. You actually have to get the darker value in between the two lighter tones in order to really make that feel round. So I hope that is clear to everybody. You can get that shadow core kind of down the middle of the folds instead of at one edge of the fold, to really make it feel like light is bouncing back into the shadow side and giving a sense of volume to the fabric. Good luck on the drawing. Let me know if you have any problems.